Hi, friends. I'm Bill Hobson from The Big Impact, and in just a moment, you're going to hear my interview with Karen Kingsbury. And I know most of you are watching this because you saw her name in the title, and you're big fans of her writing, and you'll be even a bigger fan after you hear our conversation. I just want to take 30 seconds to invite you to check out The Big Impact in podcast form on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, everywhere podcasts are found. Because every week we share inspiring and uplifting stories with guests from all walks of life. We'd love to have you check out the podcast every single week. You can also go back and for free listen to every interview we've done in the past 4.5 to 5 years by going online to bigimpactradio.com. Love to have you join the Big Impact family. Thanks so much. And now enjoy our chat with Karen Kingsbury. Over the course of The Big Impact, our 4.5, almost 5 years of doing the program, I've had the privilege of interviewing hundreds of guests from all walks of life, some of them Hall of Fame athletes and Grammy Award winners, astronauts. And every single time that I do that, I come away inspired and encouraged with the positive conversations we have. But no guest has ever gotten my mom's attention quite as quickly as when I told her just a few minutes ago that today I got the chance to interview her favorite author. And she right away said, Karen Kingsbury? So Karen, the pressure's on us. Mom is listening. How are you?
Hey there, I am doing so great. And you'll have to tell your mom hi for me.
She's already enjoying your book, Forgiving Paris. We were able to send her an advance copy because she pours through those almost as fast as you can write them. I was looking through the history of the books that you've written, and am blown away by the prolific nature of your ability to sit at a keyboard and hammer away and get to work. When did all of that start for you? What was your inspiration to sit down and just be able to put your thoughts and your heart onto paper or onto a keyboard?
Well, I started writing when I was 5, which is awfully young. I kind of like stapled some pages together. I called the book The Horse. Everything was spelled wrong, but it was the beginning of a love affair with writing for me. I wrote all through school, got my degree from Cal State Northridge in Los Angeles. That was a journalism degree. And then I wrote for the newspaper, the LA Times, for a few years. And out of that came 4 true crime books that I wrote that were so sad and just, not what I wanted to write, but it allowed me to be home and be with our firstborn child. And then eventually we went on to have 6 kids. So I always get to be home writing. And that was the beginning of those true crime books. And then I started writing what I would call inspirational or life-changing fiction. It was about 23 years ago. And I've been doing that ever since.
When you made that transition over to writing inspirational and injecting your faith into the storylines, was it in conjunction with a change maybe in your own life where faith became a bigger part of it? Or did you just decide, I'm going to start pouring that part of my life into my writing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I became a relational Christian where I had Jesus as a relationship and as my savior in my mid-20s. And so by the time I was writing those true crime books, I was already a believer. I was already walking with the Lord, and he always gave me something redeeming in those stories, that was a blessing for sure. But it was really more just that it wasn't encouraging. It wasn't the kind of thing that I would want to read. And so I read actually Francine Rivers' book, Redeeming Love. I'm sure your mom knows that one too. And it just reminded me, or it proved to me, that I could write this kind of a book and I could stick to things that were real and hard, tough issues, and yet still come away with the story of redemption and second chances that I feel, as believers, we just all need.
You talk about getting that confidence and trying to figure out if you really can do this kind of a shift in your writing. It's hard to imagine, especially for those who read everything you write, hard for them to imagine that perhaps Karen Kingsbury at some time maybe had some doubts or wondered about, where she should go and if this is really going to work out. Did you ever have a period of time where you thought, yeah, I don't know if this is it?
Absolutely. Those first 6 books. So after I left true crime, my agent, who was a secular agent in New York City, he said, he was real thick New York accent. And he said, Karen, you were going to be a star. Why would you want to leave true crime? And I'd never read true crime. It was just because I happened to have been a reporter and these stories came about. So I started writing. I wrote my first novel that was, a life-changing fiction novel, a Christian fiction novel, in about 23 years ago, called Where Yesterday Lives. It took a year, Bill, to even get it published, a whole year. And after that happened, it was like the next 6 books we were at minimum wage. I mean, my husband was a teacher, and there I was, trying to make things work as a novelist. And I was thinking, I'm gonna have to wait tables to make this like hobby work out. So there was definitely that time when it didn't seem like it was going to work. And then the Lord just opened the floodgates with the Baxter family.
I was just going to ask you about that. I was going to ask you what turned the corner so that you didn't have to pursue the other side jobs and you could really concentrate on your writing. So the Baxter family was the key catalyst for kind of propelling you into the national consciousness, correct?
Definitely. I mean, the Baxters, like just almost like overnight, it wasn't, but it felt like it. They became the family that everyone could identify with. Either they were a part of a family like that, or they wanted to be a part of a family like that. So the Baxters became everyone's family, and it grew like crazy. And I mean, even still, I have people saying, "I have the Baxters on my prayer list at church." So it's been very fun.
What is it about the family connection that American audiences devour? Let's think back here for a little bit. The Walton family, the Huxtable family, in a television sense. And it was the number one show on television, regardless of what you think of Dr. Huxtable these days. In its heyday, that show, there was nothing bigger. And then the Baxter series, what do you think it is about that family dynamic that captures the attention of an audience so much?
I think people are wanting that. It's a comfortable feeling. And especially today, right, where things are so divided and you can't even necessarily see the people that you love. And that's been going on far too long now. So I think people love the idea of just turning on a show or reading a book and being able to say, I am now in that setting. I am instantly transported to being part of a big and loving family where nothing's perfect about it, but they perfectly love each other and come back together at the end of the day.
Yeah, very much so. I was also thinking about, this last couple of years where we've had lots of extra time at home and lots of extra time with the family. What have you seen the pandemic do to reading habits? I've been reading a little bit that they've actually increased. The people have gone back to books because they've run out of everything on Netflix, and there's only so much you can watch sitting in front of a screen. Is the world of Karen Kingsbury and maybe the books that have been out for a while getting some new life injected into them?
It is. I can for sure see that. Lots of new readers, young readers, which I'm so thankful to see because it matters, that they're a part of that. I think a beautiful thing that happened during the pandemic with my readers was we saved a bookstore, or they saved a bookstore. So the bookstore here in Franklin, Tennessee, called Landmark, was my inspiration for a book that I wrote, a standalone book called The Bridge. And it ended up being a Hallmark movie, The Bridge. It was a Christmas movie on Hallmark. And so people go now, I mean, because of that, the notoriety that they gained, people would come by like every day. They have people from somewhere in the world come by and want their autograph. The real couple that run the store that were my inspiration, and they sign books, and it's they're Joel and Carol are their names in the book. They were Charlie and Donna. Well, when the pandemic hit, no foot traffic, and it's an old bookstore that's built in literally what was a Civil War hospital back in the day. So it's the old antebellum type style house. They live upstairs. So all of a sudden there were no sales, no traffic. So I asked if we could get an online program going and I could have my readers buy the next book from them. And they bought 5,000 copies. My readers did. And we put them together in my house. They didn't even have room in the store. And it was just this really fun story. It got picked up by the news, how readers saved a bookstore.
There is still something about being able to curl up with a good book. And in this digital era, it still matters. It's still a thing. In fact, you and I were talking off air a little bit about a recent trip you made to an historic hotel in northern Michigan. And quite often on the front porch of that hotel, you'll look and you'll just see people sitting in those white rocking chairs, just reading as they look out over the Straits of Mackinac. There is something about it. And thankfully there is, since that's where Karen makes her living, including with the book that's coming out here soon, called Forgiving Paris. And you dive into some pretty heavy lifting topics in this book. We're talking about addiction and suicide. And in the context of inspiration, we know you have a gift for turning difficulty into a lesson and into inspiration. But can you take me into what led you to those topics in Forgiving Paris?
Yeah, Forgiving Paris does have some really heavy issues. I think, this is a story where it's a standalone, but it does involve Ashley Baxter, one of the main Baxter characters, and she is going back to Paris because she's got an art show. So she's an artist, and it's a big deal, and she's going with her husband, and it's their anniversary. So in all ways, it should be a great trip, but she's remembering the worst decision she ever made. She had an affair with a married man when she was a single woman, when she was 19. And it's something she regrets to this day. Now she's taken it to the Lord, and she's already received his forgiveness a long time ago, but she's never forgiven herself. And now she's going back to Paris, where she has to finally face what had happened and figure out a way to find redemption and forgiveness for herself. And as she does that, what's amazing is God crosses her path with some people whose lives were changed for the better because of what she did, because of what happened in Paris, not because of what she did, but because of her time there, which she chalks up as only bad. God had redeeming pieces to that. And those moments are what really make Forgiving Paris an emotional read, that in your worst of times, God was still at work. He still saw you, and there were redeeming pieces to it.
What the enemy intended for harm, God intended for good. I mean, that's
Exactly.
straight from Scripture. And yet a lot of people struggle with forgiveness and holding on to sins of the past. It's not always just fiction, right? Sometimes it's a very real story. How hard is it to write that story of redemption when you think through the difficulty of the shame, the guilt, maybe the fallout, the hurt that was caused to those that were in the surrounding, the ripple effect, so to speak? How do you write that story of redemption? It's a difficult journey, I would think, to put into words.
It is. Early in the story, her husband, his name is Landon, he tells Ashley, he's been reading in Mark chapter 4 in the Bible. And he says, it's an account that we read in other places where Jesus is calming the storm for his disciples. And he's asleep on the boat. They wake him up. We're going to drown. And Jesus wakes up and he calms the storm. But in Mark chapter 4, that account also mentions that there were other little boats on the sea that day. So the storm was calm for them too. So this is the mindset. He says, I want you to go to Paris looking for the other little boats. So when they go, that is what God ends up bringing these things to the surface. And, one of the things that made this particular story a little bit different is just that she had the affair with a married artist back, 23 years earlier. But he was a person who had affairs every day. So he was living that sort of lifestyle. She thought it was just her. No, it was many other people who he was having an affair with. So there's not going to be redemption and healing with him. He's actually not even alive anymore. So he's really out of the picture. But it's these other people who were working at the gallery, a girl who was going to have an abortion. I mean, people whose lives were changed for the better in such beautiful ways because Ashley was a part of their story, and she wouldn't have been there if it weren't for this these decisions that she made. So yeah, God took, it was a Romans 8:28 where God works all things to the good for those who love him.
I have to think that when you're doing book signings or making appearances or speaking, almost every time somebody will come up to you and say, you just told my story, right?
Oh yeah.
I have to think that's happened thousands of times over the years of all of the writing that you've done for this storyline and Forgiving Paris. If and when that happens, I would think that's a fairly big step for somebody to take, to come up and, probably with tears in their eyes and say, how did you know?
That, and a couple people have been able to read an advanced copy of Forgiving Paris. So I've actually had a few people who have written and said to me, one girl she just said, I can't tell you what I did, what I did was too terrible for me to even mention. But you took me to that place and allowed me finally, for all time, to lay it aside, to forgive myself and accept the grace of Jesus Christ over it. I mean, those kinds of stories I can only imagine as this book takes its, finds its wings and legs and is out there for everyone to read, how that will become such a healing piece. And especially today in our cancel culture where grace is in short supply, Jesus is the only one who can give us what we need.
The ability to dive into difficult topics and turn them around into inspiration is certainly a gift that you have, and you've exercised that gift for a lot of years. What keeps you going, and what's next after Forgiving Paris?
Well, I've got a novel that is actually going to I have a TV series coming out on Amazon next year. It's called The Baxters, and it will be, we already have 3 seasons filmed and in the can, which is great. There's endless number of seasons that they can do. And so I have a book called The Baxters, and it's matching the TV show name, that'll be a prequel, and it'll be kind of like the new book number 1, and that'll come out in April. So that's exciting. And then a couple other TV series based on my books that'll be coming out at the end of next year. And my son Tyler and I are actually screenwriting those episodes as we speak. So screenwriting is a super fun new thing I'm doing.
I was just going to ask you how hard it can be to hand off control of your story to a production team and see how they make little changes. You've heard a million times, hey, the book's way better than the movie. So in this case, do you get to have full editorial control of what comes out on the screen?
I really do. It's actually like a miracle, Bill, because that's not normal. But my agent has done a great job of making sure that I do get to have the final say. I get to edit the scripts for the Baxters. I'm not writing those, but then for the 2 new series that'll be coming out next year, Tyler and I are writing the actual storyline. So we get to, there's no one telling us, oh, no, you can't have that, or, we don't say it that way. I hope they're going to be shows that next year at this time, we are like excited because they're what people are watching instead of what's on Netflix.
I was just thinking about this. I mentioned that people will often come up and say, you've told my story. I'm wondering about your own family, whether it's Tyler or the other kids, if they're frequently approached and saying, was that about you? Was that about you? Was that about you? Because if you have the Baxter family and the Kingsbury family, I don't know if there are any parallels between them.
I think that my kids can definitely see if, I always tell them it's not going to be their big story that I'll ever be writing in a book, but there might be something funny that happened to one of us on a vacation, or, a conversation or moment that we shared that might show up in a book. I did used to have a sign in my kitchen, Bill, that said, be careful what you say. It might wind up in my novel.
It can be used against you in a written form in the days ahead. What a pleasure to chat with you. And as we celebrate inspiring stories here on the Big Impact, I have to think that if you look back on where we are now near the end of 2021, look all the way back to when you first sat down, hammered out some pages, wondered if you'd have to also take some side jobs on. As you look back at all of that, what is the thought that you have, Karen? I'm not saying this is the after picture, but certainly the before picture is pretty clear. And it's a very different place than where you are right now. I don't know, what goes through your mind when you think about a career that's still thriving?
Well, my dad, when he was alive, was one of my greatest fans, and he just would cheer me on, and he would read things I'd write when I was in middle school or high school, and he'd get tears in his eyes and say, Karen, one day everyone is going to know your work, and someone has to be the next best-selling author. I think it's going to be you. And I just have to believe, Bill, that God's given him a window in heaven to see just what God has done and how bigger than anything I could have ever done. God puts a story on my heart. He has these people like your mom. He has those people in mind. And when they come up and say, you wrote my story, it's because God knew what they needed. I didn't know what they needed, but God did. So I just look and it's just amazing. I mean, the bigger it gets, the smaller I feel, and the more I'm absolutely confident that God is doing something beyond what I could have asked or imagined, and that my dad was right. And that's just a beautiful thing.
Yeah, so good. And by the way, in the future, as you're writing, if you ever need a character that would be sort of a radio or TV host, if you want to plug the name in there, it would make a really good Christmas present for my mom in Florida.
Okay, I'm going to keep that in mind. I might just do that. I'm always looking for character names. So yeah.
I have to ask you about that. You mentioned earlier that you knew somebody in real life with this name, and then in the book they go by this name. What is the protocol for naming in books? Is it a legal thing? Is it just a preference kind of a thing per author? I'm wondering how and why you have to come up with an alias.
Well, okay, so Charlie and Donna were my fictitious characters in The Bridge, and The Bridge is really like this store called Landmark. Well, there was really no tragedy that happened to Landmark, but I made a tragedy that, let's say they had a terrible flood, like from a storm, and lost all their inventory, and the town kind of comes together and helps them rebuild. That's sort of the Christmas story of The Bridge. There's a love story that works in with it as well. But because it was very different, I mean, obviously I'm not writing nonfiction, and nonfiction you would have the same name, but it's really not a legal issue. It's really just they were honored. So I said, I'm going to write a story about this bookstore. Like, this bookstore is a character in my book, The Bridge. And so they loved that. But usually when I'm naming characters, I mean, I'll go to babynames.com. Sometimes I'll go to, if I'm looking to name a guy, I may go to the NFL website and look at the names of all the players from all the teams and come up with some good names that way. There's a lot of different ways to do it. When my husband was coaching basketball, when we were raising our kids, I would just put some of those kids' names in, and I would let them know, like, hey, if you scored 20 points, you're going to be in a book.
Now, these days they would demand residuals. So
I know
it's a little different world these days.
Yes.
Best to you as Forgiving Paris makes its way throughout the marketplace and is, I'm sure, read by millions of your devoted followers, because these days I think there's a Karen Kingsbury fan club that basically follows everything you do, right? There has to be a gathering at some point. Is there a Kingsbury convention every year?
Well, we have one online. It's I have obviously on my social medias, but on Facebook there is an official online Karen Kingsbury book club, and it is the largest one of its kind. There's nothing like it. It's got 23,000 people. And these are people who had to sign in and get accepted in. However, my sister runs it. And these are people that every day they're chiming in and what book they read. It's kind of incredible.
It's a good place to be, that's for sure. Karen, thank you so much for sharing. And we'll look forward to catching up with you when the next project comes out.
Well, thank you so much. And if people want to find out more about Forgiving Paris, they can just do that at KarenKingsbury.com.